The Story, Book the First, Chapter 6 of the Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the First, Chapter 6. The Order of the Dishes. When Miss Notman assumed the post of housekeeper in Lady Loring's service, she was accurately described as a competent and respectable person, and was praised with perfect truth for her incorruptible devotion to the interests of her employers. On its weaker side, her character was represented by the wearing of a youthful wig, and the erroneous conviction that she still possessed a fine figure. The ruling idea in her narrow little mind was the idea of her own dignity. Any offense offered in this direction oppressed her memory for days together, and found its way outward in speech to any human being whose attention she could secure. At 5 o'clock on the day which followed his introduction to Romayne, Father Benwell sat drinking his coffee in the housekeeper's room, to all appearance as much at his ease as if he had known Miss Notman from the remote days of her childhood. A new contribution to the housekeeper's little library of devotional works lay on the table, and bore silent witness to the means by which he had made those first advances which had won him his present position. Miss Notman's sense of dignity was doubly flattered. She had a priest for her guest, and a new book with the reverend gentleman's autograph inscribed on the title page. "Is your coffee to your liking, Father?" "A little more sugar, if you please." Miss Notman was proud of her hand, viewed as one of the meritorious details of her figure. She took up the sugar tongs with suavity and grace. She dropped the sugar into the cup with a youthful pleasure in ministering to the minor desires of her illustrious guest. "It is so good of you, Father, to honor me in this way," she said, with the appearance of 16 superinduced upon the reality of 60. Father Benwell was an adept at moral disguises of all kinds. On this occasion he wore the disguise of pastoral simplicity. "I'm an idle old man at this hour of the afternoon," he said. "I hope I'm not keeping you from any household duties." "I generally enjoy my duties," Miss Notman answered. "Today they have not been so agreeable as usual. It is a relief to me to have done with them. Even my humble position has its trials." Persons acquainted with Miss Notman's character, hearing these last words, would have at once changed the subject. When she spoke of her humble position, she invariably referred to some offense offered to her dignity, and she was invariably ready to state the grievance at full length. Ignorant of this peculiarity, Father Benwell committed a fatal error. He inquired with courteous interest what the housekeeper's trials might be. "Oh, sir, they are beneath your notice," said Miss Notman modestly. "At the same time, I should feel it an honor to have the benefit of your opinion. I should so like to know that you do not altogether disapprove of my conduct under some provocation. You see, Father, the whole responsibility of ordering the dinners falls on me. And when there is company, as there is this evening, the responsibility is particularly trying to a timid person like myself." "A large dinner party, Miss Notman?" "Oh, dear, no! Quite the reverse. Only one gentleman, Mr. Romayne." Father Benwell set down his cup of coffee half way to his lips. He at once drew the correct conclusion that the invitation to Romayne must have been given and accepted after he had left the picture gallery. That the object was to bring Romayne and Stella together, under circumstances which would rapidly improve their acquaintance, was as plain to him as if he had heard it confessed in so many words. If he had only remained in the gallery, he might have become acquainted with a form of persuasion used to induce a man so unsocial as Romayne to accept an invitation. "I have myself to blame," he thought bitterly, for being left in the dark. "Anything wrong with the coffee?" Miss Notman asked anxiously. He rushed on his fate. He said, "Nothing whatever. Pray go on." Miss Notman went on. "You see, Father, Lady Loring was unusually particular about the dinner on this occasion. She said, 'Lord Loring reminds me that Mr. Romayne is a very little eater, and yet very difficult to please in what he does eat.' Of course, I consulted my experience, and suggested exactly the sort of dinner that was wanted under the circumstances. I wish to do her ladyship the utmost justice. She made no objection to the dinner in itself. On the contrary, she complimented me on what she was pleased to call my ready invention. But when we came next to the order in which the dishes were to be served—" Miss Notman paused in the middle of the sentence, and shuddered over the private and poignant recollections which the order of the dishes called up. By this time Father Benwell had discovered his mistake. He took a mean advantage of Miss Notman's susceptibilities to slip his own private inquiries into the interval of silence. "Pardon my ignorance," he said. "My own poor dinner is a matter of 10 minutes and one dish. I don't understand a difference of opinion on a dinner for 3 people only. Lord and Lady Loring, 2. Mr. Romayne, 3. Oh, perhaps I'm mistaken. Perhaps Miss Eyrecourt makes a fourth?" "Certainly, Father." "A very charming person, Miss Notman. I only speak as a stranger. You, no doubt, are much better acquainted with Miss Eyrecourt?" "Much better indeed, if I may presume to say so," Miss Notman replied. "She is my lady's intimate friend. We have often talked of Miss Eyrecourt during the many years of my residence in this house. On such subjects her ladyship treats me quite on the footing of a humble friend. A complete contrast to the tone she took, Father, when we came to the order of the dishes. We agreed, of course, about the soup and the fish; but we had a very little divergence of opinion, as I may call it, on the subject of the dishes to follow. Her ladyship said, first the sweetbreads, and then the cutlets. I ventured to suggest that the sweetbreads, as white meat, had better not immediately follow the turbot, as white fish. The brown meat, my lady, I said, as an agreeable variety presented to the eye, and then the white meat, recalling pleasant remembrances of the white fish. You see the point, Father?" "I see, Miss Notman, that you are a consummate mistress of an art which is quite beyond poor me. Was Miss Eyrecourt present at the little discussion?" "Oh, no, indeed! I should have objected to her presence. I should have said she was a young lady out of her proper place." "Yes, I understand. Is Miss Eyrecourt an only child?" "She has 2 sisters, Father Benwell. One of them is in a convent." "Ah, indeed!" "And the other is dead." "Sad for the father and mother, Miss Notman." "Pardon me, sad for the mother, no doubt. The father died long since." "Ay, ay! A sweet woman, the mother? At least, I think I've heard so." Miss Notman shook her head. "I should wish to guard myself against speaking unjustly of any one," she said. "But when you talk of a sweet woman, you imply, as it seems to me, the domestic virtues. Mrs. Eyrecourt is essentially a frivolous person." A frivolous person is, in the vast majority of cases, a person easily persuaded to talk, and not disposed to be reticent in keeping secrets. Father Benwell began to see his way already to the necessary information. "Is Mrs. Eyrecourt living in London?" he inquired. "Oh, dear, no! At this time of year she lives entirely in other people's houses, goes from one country seat to another, and only thinks of amusing herself. No domestic qualities, Father. She would know nothing of the order of the dishes. Lady Loring, I should have told you, gave way in the matter of the sweetbread. It was only at quite the latter part of my menu, as the French call it,
that she showed a spirit of opposition. Well, well, I won't dwell on that. I will only ask you, Father, at what part of a dinner an oyster omelette ought to be served?"
Father Benwell seized his opportunity of discovering Mrs. Eyrecourt's present address. "My dear lady," he said, "I know no more when the omelette ought to be served than Mrs. Eyrecourt herself. It must be very pleasant to a lady of her way of thinking to enjoy the beauties of nature inexpensively, as seen in other people's houses, from the point of view of a welcome guest. I wonder whether she is staying at any country seat which I happen to have seen."
"Oh, she may be in England, Scotland, or Ireland, for all I know,"
Miss Notman answered, with an unaffected ignorance which placed her good faith beyond doubt.
"Consult your own taste, Father. After eating jelly cream and ice pudding, could you even look at an oyster omelette without shuddering? Would you believe it? Her ladyship proposed to serve the omelette with the cheese oysters, after sweets! I am not, as yet, a married woman."
Father Benwell made a last desperate effort to pave the way for one more question before he submitted to defeat. "That must be your fault, my dear lady," he interposed with his persuasive smile. Miss Notman simpered.
"You confuse me, Father," she said softly.
"I speak from inward conviction, Miss Notman. To a looker on like myself, it is sad to see how many sweet women, who might be angels in the households of worthy men, prefer to lead a single life. The Church, I know, exalts the single life to the highest place; but even the Church allows exceptions to its rule. Under this roof, for example, I think I see two exceptions. One of them my unfeigned respect" he bowed to Miss Notman "forbids me to indicate more particularly. The other seems, to my humble view, to be the young lady of whom we have been speaking. Is it not strange that Miss Eyrecourt has never been married?" The trap had been elaborately set. Father Benwell had every reason to anticipate that Miss Notman would walk into it. The disconcerting housekeeper walked up to it, and then proved unable to advance a step further.
"I once made the same remark myself to Lady Loring," she said.
Father Benwell's pulse began to quicken its beat. "Yes?" he murmured in tones of the gentlest encouragement.
"And her ladyship," Miss Notman proceeded, "did not encourage me to go on. 'There are reasons for not pursuing that subject,' she said, 'reasons into which I am sure you will not expect me to enter.' She spoke with a flattering confidence in my prudence, which I felt gratefully. Such a contrast to her tone when the omelette presented itself in the order of the dishes! As I said just now, I am not a married woman; but if I proposed to my husband to give him an oyster omelette after his puddings and his pies, I should not be surprised if he said to me, 'My dear, have you taken leave of your senses?' I reminded Lady Loring, most respectfully, that a cheese omelette might be in its proper place, if it followed the sweets. An oyster omelette, I suggested, surely comes after the birds. I should be sorry to say that her ladyship lost her temper. I will only mention that I kept mine. Let me repeat what she said, and leave you, Father, to draw your own conclusions. She said, 'Which of us is mistress in this house, Miss Notman?' I ordered the oyster omelette to come in with the cheese. There was not only irritability, there was contempt, oh yes, contempt in her tone. Out of respect for myself, I made no reply. As a Christian I can forgive; as a wounded gentlewoman I may not find it so easy to forget."
Miss Notman laid herself back in her easy chair. She looked as if she had suffered martyrdom, and only regretted having been obliged to mention it. Father Benwell surprised the wounded gentlewoman by rising to his feet.
"You are not going away already, Father?"
"Time flies fast in your society, dear Miss Notman. I have an engagement, and I am late for it already." The housekeeper smiled sadly.
At least let me hear that you don't disapprove of my conduct under trying circumstances," she said.
Father Benwell took her hand. "A true Christian only feels offenses to pardon them," he remarked in his priestly and paternal character. "You have shown me, Miss Notman, that you are a true Christian. My evening has indeed been well spent. God bless you." He pressed her hand; he shed on her the light of his fatherly smile; he sighed, and took his leave. Miss Notman's eyes followed him out with devotional admiration. Father Benwell still preserved his serenity of temper when he was out of the housekeeper's sight. One important discovery he had made, in spite of the difficulties placed in his way. A compromising circumstance had unquestionably occurred in Stella's past life, and, in all probability, a man was in some way connected with it. "My evening has not been entirely thrown away," he thought, as he ascended the stairs which led from the housekeeper's room to the hall. End of chapter 6. Read by Lars Rolander. The Story, Book the First, Chapter 7 of the Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the First, Chapter 7. The Influence of Stella. Entering the hall, Father Benwell heard a knock at the house door. The servants appeared to recognize the knock. The porter admitted Lord Loring. Father Benwell advanced and made his bow. It was a perfect obeisance of its kind, respect for Lord Loring, unobtrusively accompanied by respect for himself. "Has your lordship been walking in the park?" he inquired. "I have been out on business," Lord Loring answered, "and I should like to tell you about it. If you can spare me a few minutes, come into the library. Some time since," he resumed when the door was closed, "I think I mentioned that my friends had been speaking to me on a subject of some importance, the subject of opening my picture gallery occasionally to the public." "I remember," said Father Benwell. "Has your lordship decided what to do?" "Yes, I have decided, as the phrase is, to go with the times, and follow the example of other owners of picture galleries. Don't suppose I ever doubted that it is my duty to extend, to the best of my ability, the civilizing influences of art. My only hesitation in the matter arose from a dread of some accident happening, or some injury being done to the pictures. Even now, I can only persuade myself to try the experiment under certain restrictions." "A wise decision, undoubtedly," said Father Benwell. "In such a city as this, you could hardly open your gallery to anybody who happens to pass the house door." "I am glad you agree with me, Father. The gallery will be open for the first time on Monday. Any respectably dressed person, presenting a visiting card at the offices of the librarians in Bond Street and Regent Street, will receive a free ticket of admission; the number of tickets, it is needless to say, being limited, and the gallery being only open to the public 2 days in the week. You will be here, I suppose, on Monday?" "Certainly. My work in the library, as your lordship can see, has only begun." "I am very anxious about the success of this experiment," said Lord Loring. "Do look in at the gallery once or twice in the course of the day, and tell me what your own impression is." Having expressed his readiness to assist the experiment in every possible way, Father Benwell still lingered in the library. He was secretly conscious of a hope that he might, at the 11th hour, be invited to join Romayne at the dinner table. Lord Loring only looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was nearly time to dress for dinner. The priest had no alternative but to take the hint and leave the house. 5 minutes after he had withdrawn, a messenger delivered a letter for Lord Loring, in which Father Benwell's interests were directly involved. The letter was from Romayne. It contained his excuses for breaking his engagement literally at an hour's notice. "Only yesterday," he wrote, "I had a return of what you, my dear friend, call the delusion of the voice. The nearer the hour of your dinner approaches, the more keenly I fear that the same thing may happen in your house. Pity me, and forgive me." Even good natured Lord Loring felt some difficulty in pitying and forgiving, when he read these lines. "This sort of caprice might be excusable in a woman," he thought. "A man ought really to be capable of exercising some self control. Poor Stella! And what will my wife say?" He walked up and down the library, with Stella's disappointment and Lady Loring's indignation prophetically present in his mind. There was, however, no help for it. He must accept his responsibility, and be the bearer of the bad news. He was on the point of leaving the library, when a visitor appeared. The visitor was no less a person than Romayne himself. "Have I arrived before my letter?" he asked eagerly. Lord Loring showed him the letter. "Throw it into the fire," he said, "and let me try to excuse myself for having written it. You remember the happier days when you used to call me the creature of impulse. An impulse produced that letter; another impulse brings me here to disown it. I can only explain my strange conduct by asking you to help me at the outset. Will you carry your memory back to the day of the medical consultation on my case? I want you to correct me, if I inadvertently misrepresent my advisers. Two of them were physicians. The third and last was a surgeon, a personal friend of yours, and he, as well as I recollect, told you how the consultation ended?" "Quite right, Romayne, so far." "The first of the two physicians," Romayne proceeded, "declared my case to be entirely attributable to nervous derangement, and to be curable by purely medical means. I speak ignorantly, but in plain English, that, I believe, was the substance of what he said." "The substance of what he said," Lord Loring replied, "and the substance of his prescriptions, which I think you afterward tore up." "If you have no faith in a prescription," said Romayne, "that is, in my opinion, the best use to which you can put it. When it came to the turn of the second physician, he differed with the first as absolutely as one man can differ with another. The third medical authority, your friend the surgeon, took a middle course, and brought the consultation to an end by combining the first physician's view and the second physician's view, and mingling the two opposite forms of treatment in one harmonious result." Lord Loring remarked that this was not a very respectful way of describing the conclusion of the medical proceedings. That it was the conclusion, however, he could not honestly deny. "As long as I am right," said Romayne, "nothing else appears to be of much importance. As I told you at the time, the second physician appeared to me to be the only one of the three authorities who really understood my case. Do you mind giving me, in a few words, your own impression of what he said?" "Are you sure that I shall not distress you?" "On the contrary, you may help me to hope." "As I remember it," said Lord Loring, "the doctor did not deny the influence of the body over the mind. He was quite willing to admit that the state of your nervous system might be one, among other predisposing causes, which led you I really hardly like to go on." "Which led me," Romayne continued, finishing the sentence for his friend, "to feel that I never shall forgive myself, accident or no accident, for having taken that man's life. Now go on." "The delusion that you still hear the voice," Lord Loring proceeded, "is, in the doctor's opinion, the moral result of the morbid state of your mind at the time when you really heard the voice on the scene of the duel. The influence acts physically, of course, by means of certain nerves. But it is essentially a moral influence, and its power over you is greatly maintained by the self accusing view of the circumstances which you persist in taking. That, in substance, is my recollection of what the doctor said." "And when he was asked what remedies he proposed to try," Romayne inquired, "do you remember his answer? 'The mischief which moral influences have caused, moral influences alone can remedy.'" "I remember," said Lord Loring. "And he mentioned, as examples of what he meant, the occurrence of some new and absorbing interest in your life, or the working of some complete change in your habits of thought, or perhaps some influence exercised over you by a person previously unknown, appearing under unforeseen circumstances, or in scenes quite new to you."
Romayne's eyes sparkled. "Now you're coming to it!" he cried. "Now I feel sure that I recall correctly the last words the doctor said. If my view is the right one, I should not be surprised to hear that the recovery which we all wish to see had found its beginning in such apparently trifling circumstances as the tone of some other person's voice, or the influence of some other person's look. That plain expression of his opinion only occurred to my memory after I had written my foolish letter of excuse. I spare you the course of other recollections that followed, to come at once to the result. For the first time I have the hope, the faint hope, that the voice which haunts me has been once already controlled by one of the influences of which the doctor spoke, the influence of a look." If he had said this to Lady Loring instead of her husband, she would have understood him at once. Lord Loring asked for a word more of explanation. "I told you yesterday," Romayne answered, "that a dread of the return of the voice had been present to me all the morning, and that I had come to see the picture with an idea of trying if change would relieve me. While I was in the gallery, I was free from the dread and free from the voice. When I returned to the hotel, it tortured me; and Mr. Penrose, I grieve to say, saw what I suffered. You and I attributed the remission to the change of scene. I now believe we were both wrong. Where was the change? In seeing you and Lady Loring, I saw the two oldest friends I have. In visiting your gallery, I only revived the familiar associations of hundreds of other visits. To what influence was I really indebted for my respite? Don't try to dismiss the question by laughing at my morbid fancies. Morbid fancies are realities to a man like me. Remember the doctor's words, Loring. Think of a new face, seen in your house. Think of a look that searched my heart for the first time." Lord Loring glanced once more at the clock on the mantelpiece. The hands pointed to the dinner hour.
"Miss Eyrecourt?" he whispered.
"Yes, Miss Eyrecourt." The library door was thrown open by a servant. Stella herself entered the room. End of chapter 7. Read by Lars Rolander. Book the First, Chapter 8 of The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the First, Chapter 8. The Priest or the Woman? Lord Loring hurried away to his dressing room. "I won't be more than 10 minutes," he said, and left Romayne and Stella together. She was attired with her customary love of simplicity. White lace was the only ornament on her dress of delicate silvery gray. Her magnificent hair was left to plead its own merits, without adornment of any sort. Even the brooch which fastened her lace pelerine was of plain gold only. Conscious that she was showing her beauty to the greatest advantage in the eyes of a man of taste, she betrayed a little of the embarrassment which Romayne had already noticed at the moment when she gave him her hand. They were alone, and it was the first time she had seen him in evening dress. It may be that women have no positive appreciation of what is beautiful in form and color, or it may be that they have no opinions of their own when the laws of fashion have spoken. This at least is certain, that not one of them in 1,000 sees anything objectionable in the gloomy and hideous evening costume of a gentleman in the 19th century.
A handsome man is, to their eyes, more seductive than ever in the contemptible black coat and the stiff white cravat which he wears in common with the servant who waits on him at table. After a stolen glance at Romayne, Stella lost all confidence in herself. She began turning over the photographs on the table. The momentary silence which followed their first greeting became intolerable to her. Rather than let it continue, she impulsively confessed the uppermost idea in her mind when she entered the room. "I thought I heard my name when I came in," she said. "Were you and Lord Loring speaking of me?" Romayne owned without hesitation that they had been speaking of her. She smiled, and turned over another photograph. But when did sun pictures ever act as a restraint on a woman's curiosity? The words passed her lips in spite of her. "I suppose I mustn't ask what you were saying?" It was impossible to answer this plainly without entering into explanations from which Romayne shrank. He hesitated. She turned over another photograph. "I understand," she said. "You were talking of my faults." She paused, and stole another look at him. "I will try to correct my faults, if you will tell me what they are." Romayne felt that he had no alternative but to tell the truth, under certain reserves. "Indeed, you are wrong," he said. "We were talking of the influence of a tone or a look on a sensitive person." "The influence on me?" she asked. "No, the influence which you might exercise on another person." She knew perfectly well that he was speaking of himself, but she was determined to feel the pleasure of making him own it. "If I have any such influence as you describe," she began, "I hope it is for good." "Certainly for good." "You speak positively, Mr. Romayne, almost as positively, only that can hardly be, as if you were speaking from experience." He might still have evaded a direct reply, if she had been content with merely saying this. But she looked at him while she spoke. He answered the look. "Shall I own that you are right?" he said. "I was thinking of my own experience yesterday." She returned to the photographs. "It sounds impossible," she rejoined softly. There was a pause. "Was it anything I said?" she asked. "No. It was only when you looked at me. But for that look, I don't think I should have been here to day." She shut up the photographs on a sudden, and drew her chair a little away from him. "I hope," she said, "you have not so poor an opinion of me as to think I like to be flattered." Romayne answered with an earnestness that instantly satisfied her. "I should think it an act of insolence to flatter you," he said, "if you knew the true reason why I hesitated to accept Lady Loring's invitation. If I could own to you the new hope for myself that has brought me here, you would feel, as I feel, that I have been only speaking the truth. I daren't say yet that I owe you a debt of gratitude for such a little thing as a look. I must wait till time puts certain strange fancies of mine to the proof." "Fancies about me, Mr. Romayne?" Before he could answer, the dinner bell rang. Lord and Lady Loring entered the library together. The dinner having pursued its appointed course, always excepting the case of the omelette, the head servant who had waited at table was graciously invited to rest after his labors in the housekeeper's room. Having additionally conciliated him by means of a glass of rare liquor, Miss Notman, still feeling her grievance as acutely as ever, ventured to inquire, in the first place, if the gentlefolks upstairs had enjoyed their dinner. So far the report was, on the whole, favorable. But the conversation was described as occasionally flagging. The burden of the talk had been mainly borne by my lord and my lady, Mr. Romayne and Miss Eyrecourt contributing but little to the social enjoyment of the evening. Receiving this information without much appearance of interest, the housekeeper put another question, to which, judging by her manner, she attached a certain importance. She wished to know if the oyster omelette, accompanying the cheese, had been received as a welcome dish, and treated with a just recognition of its merits. The answer to this was decidedly in the negative. Mr. Romayne and Miss Eyrecourt had declined to taste it. My lord had tried it, and had left it on his plate. My lady alone had really eaten her share of the misplaced dish. Having stated this apparently trivial circumstance, the head servant was surprised by the effect which it produced on the housekeeper. She leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes, with an appearance of unutterable enjoyment. That night there was one supremely happy woman in London, and her name was Miss Notman. Ascending from the housekeeper's room to the drawing room, it is to be further reported that music was tried, as a means of getting through the time, in the absence of general conversation. Lady Loring sat down at the piano, and played as admirably as usual. At the other end of the room, Romayne and Stella were together, listening to the music. Lord Loring, walking backward and forward with a restlessness which was far from being characteristic of him in his after dinner hours, was stopped when he reached the neighborhood of the piano by a private signal from his wife. "What are you walking about for?" Lady Loring asked in a whisper, without interrupting her musical performance. "I'm not quite easy, my dear." "Turn over the music. Indigestion?" "Good heavens, Adelaide, what a question!" "Well, what is it, then?" Lord Loring looked towards Stella and her companion. "They don't seem to get on together as well as I had hoped," he said. "I should think not, when you are walking about and disturbing them. Sit down there behind me." "What am I to do?" "Am I not playing? Listen to me." "My dear, I don't understand modern German music." "Then read the evening paper." The evening paper had its attractions. Lord Loring took his wife's advice. Left entirely by themselves at the other end of the room, Romayne and Stella justified Lady Loring's belief in the result of reducing her husband to a state of repose. Stella ventured to speak first in a discreet undertone. "Do you pass most of your evenings alone, Mr. Romayne?" "Not quite alone. I have the company of my books." "Are your books the companions that you like best?" "I have been true to those companions, Miss Eyrecourt, for many years. If the doctors are to be believed, my books have not treated me very well in return. They have broken down my health, and have made me, I am afraid, a very unsocial man." He seemed about to say more, and suddenly checked the impulse. "Why am I talking of myself?" he resumed with a smile. "I never do it at other times. Is this another result of your influence over me?" He put the question with an assumed gayety. Stella made no effort on her side to answer him in the same tone. "I almost wish I really had some influence over you," she said gravely and sadly. "Why?" "I should try to induce you to shut up your books, and choose some living companion who might restore you to your happier self." "It is already done," said Romayne. "I have a new companion in Mr. Penrose." "Penrose?" she repeated. "He is the friend, is he not, of the priest here, whom they call Father Benwell?" "Yes." "I don't like Father Benwell." "Is that a reason for disliking Mr. Penrose?" "Yes," she said boldly, "because he is Father Benwell's friend." "Indeed, you are mistaken, Miss Eyrecourt. Mr. Penrose only entered yesterday on his duties as my secretary, and I have already had reason to think highly of him. Many men, after that experience of me," he added, speaking more to himself than to her, "might have asked me to find another secretary." Stella heard those last words, and looked at him in astonishment. "Were you angry with Mr. Penrose?" she asked innocently. "Is it possible that you could speak harshly to any person in your employment?" Romayne smiled. "It was not what I said," he answered. "I am subject to attacks, to sudden attacks of illness. I am sorry I alarmed Mr. Penrose by letting him see me under those circumstances." She looked at him, hesitated, and looked away again. "Would you be angry with me if I confessed something?" she said timidly. "It is impossible I can be angry with you." "Mr. Romayne, I think I have seen what your secretary saw. I know how you suffer, and how patiently you bear it." "You!" he exclaimed. "I saw you with your friend when you came on board the steamboat at Boulogne. Oh, no, you never noticed me! You never knew how I pitied you. And afterward, when you moved away by yourself and stood by the place in which the engines work, you are sure you won't think the worse of me if I tell it?" "No, no." "Your face frightened me. I can't describe it. I went to your friend, and took it on myself to say that you wanted him. It was an impulse. I meant well." "I am sure you meant well." As he spoke, his face darkened a little, betraying a momentary feeling of distrust. Had she put indiscreet questions to his traveling companion? And had the Major, under the persuasive influence of her beauty, been weak enough to answer them? "Did you speak to my friend?" he asked. "Only when I told him that he had better go to you. And I think I said afterward I was afraid you were very ill. We were in the confusion of arriving at Folkestone, and, even if I had thought it right to say more, there was no opportunity." Romayne felt ashamed of the suspicion by which he had wronged her. "You have a generous nature," he said earnestly. "Among the few people whom I know, how many would feel the interest in me that you felt?" "Don't say that, Mr. Romayne. You could have had no kinder friend than the gentleman who took care of you on your journey. Is he with you now in London?" "No." "I am sorry to hear it. You ought to have some devoted friend always near you." She spoke very earnestly. Romayne shrank with a strange shyness from letting her see how her sympathy affected him. He answered lightly. "You go almost as far as my good friend there reading the newspaper," he said. "Lord Loring doesn't scruple to tell me that I ought to marry. I know he speaks with a sincere interest in my welfare. He little thinks how he distresses me." "Why should he distress you?" "He reminds me, live as long as I may, that I must live alone. Can I ask a woman to share such a dreary life as mine? It would be selfish, it would be cruel. I should deservedly pay the penalty of allowing my wife to sacrifice herself. The time would come when she would repent having married me." Stella rose. Her eyes rested on him with a look of gentle remonstrance. "I think you hardly do women justice," she said softly. "Perhaps, some day, a woman may induce you to change your opinion." She crossed the room to the piano. "You must be tired of playing, Adelaide," she said, putting her hand caressingly on Lady Loring's shoulder. "Will you sing, Stella?" She sighed, and turned away. "Not to night," she answered. Romayne took his leave rather hurriedly. He seemed to be out of spirits, and eager to get away. Lord Loring accompanied his guest to the door. "You look sad and careworn," he said. "Do you regret having left your books to pass an evening with us?" Romayne looked up absently, and answered, "I don't know yet." Returning to report this extraordinary reply to his wife and Stella, Lord Loring found the drawing room empty. Eager for a little private conversation, the two ladies had gone upstairs. "Well," said Lady Loring, as they sat together over the fire, "what did he say?" Stella only repeated what he had said before she rose and left him. "What is there in Mr. Romayne's life," she asked, "which made him say that he would be selfish and cruel if he expected a woman to marry him? It must be something more than mere illness. If he had committed a crime, he could not have spoken more strongly. Do you know what it is?" Lady Loring looked uneasy. "I promised my husband to keep it a secret from everybody," she said. "It is nothing degrading, Adelaide. I am sure of that." "And you are right, my dear. I can understand that he has surprised and disappointed you. But if you knew his motives—" She stopped, and looked earnestly at Stella. "They say," she went on, "the love that lasts longest is the love of slowest growth. This feeling of yours for Romayne is of a sudden growth. Are you very sure that your whole heart is given to a man of whom you know little?" "I know that I love him," said Stella simply. "Even though he doesn't seem to as yet to love you?" Lady Loring asked. "All the more because he doesn't. I should be ashamed to make the confession to any one but you. It is useless to say any more. Good night." Lady Loring allowed her to get as far as the door, and then suddenly called her back. Stella returned, unwillingly and wearily. "My head aches and my heart aches," she said. "Let me go away to my bed." "I don't like you to go away wronging Romayne perhaps in your thoughts," said Lady Loring. "And more than that, for the sake of your own happiness, you ought to judge for yourself if this devoted love of yours may ever hope to win its reward. It is time, and more than time, that you should decide whether it is good for you to see Romayne again. Have you courage enough to do that?" "Yes, if I am convinced that it ought to be done." "Nothing would make me so happy," Lady Loring resumed, "as to know that you were one day, my dear, to be his wife. But I am not a prudent person. I can never look, as you can, to consequences. You won't betray me, Stella, if I am doing wrong in telling a secret which has been trusted to me? It is my fondness for you that misleads me. Sit down again. You shall know what the misery of Romayne's life really is." With those words, she told the terrible story of the duel, and of all that had followed it. "It is for you to say," she concluded, "whether Romayne is right. Can any woman hope to release him from the torment that he suffers, with nothing to help her but love? Determine for yourself." Stella answered instantly. "I determine to be his wife." With the same pure enthusiasm, Penrose had declared that he too devoted himself to the deliverance of Romayne. The loving woman was not more resolved to give her whole life to him than the fanatical man was resolved to convert him. On the same common battle ground the two were now to meet in unconscious antagonism. Would the priest or the woman win the day? End of chapter 8. Read by Lars Rolander. The Story, Book the First, Chapter 9 of The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the First, Chapter 9. The Public and the Pictures. On the memorable Monday, when the picture gallery was opened to the public for the first time, Lord Loring and Father Benwell met in the library. "Judging by the number of carriages already at the door," said Father Benwell, "your lordship's kindness is largely appreciated by the lovers of art." "All the tickets were disposed of in 3 hours," Lord Loring answered. "Everybody, the librarians tell me, is eager to see the pictures. Have you looked in yet?" "Not yet. I thought I would get on first with my work among the books." "I have just come from the gallery," Lord Loring continued, "and here I am driven out of it again by the remarks of some of the visitors. You know my beautiful copies of Raphael's Cupid and Psyche designs? The general impression, especially among the ladies, is that they are disgusting and indecent. That was enough for me. If you happen to meet Lady Loring and Stella, kindly tell them that I have gone to the club." "Do the ladies propose paying a visit to the gallery?" "Of course, to see the people. I have recommended them to wait until they are ready to go out for their drive. In their indoor costumes, they might become the object of general observation as the ladies of the house. I shall be anxious to hear, Father, if you can discover the civilizing influences of art among my guests in the gallery. Good morning." Father Benwell rang the bell when Lord Loring had left him. "Do the ladies drive out today at their usual hour?" he inquired, when the servant appeared. The man answered in the affirmative. The carriage was ordered at 3 o'clock. At 2:30, Father Benwell slipped quietly into the gallery. He posted himself midway between the library door and the grand entrance, on the watch, not for the civilizing influences of art, but for the appearance of Lady Loring and Stella. He was still of opinion that Stella's frivolous mother might be turned into a source of valuable information on the subject of her daughter's earlier life. The first step toward attaining this object was to discover Mrs. Eyrecourt's present address. Stella would certainly know it; and Father Benwell felt a just confidence in his capacity to make the young lady serviceable, in this respect, to the pecuniary interests of the Church. After an interval of a quarter of an hour, Lady Loring and Stella entered the gallery by the library door. Father Benwell at once advanced to pay his respects. For some little time he discreetly refrained from making any attempt to lead the conversation to the topic that he had in view. He was too well acquainted with the insatiable interest of women in looking at other women to force himself into notice. The ladies made their remarks on the pretensions to beauty and to taste in dress among the throng of visitors, and Father Benwell waited by them, and listened with the resignation of a modest young man. Patience, being a virtue, is sometimes its own reward. Two gentlemen, evidently interested in the pictures, approached the priest. He drew back with his ready politeness to let them see the picture before which he happened to be standing. The movement disturbed Stella. She turned sharply, noticed one of the gentlemen, the taller of the two, became deadly pale, and instantly quitted the gallery. Lady Loring, looking where Stella had looked, frowned angrily, and followed Miss Eyrecourt into the library, whilst Father Benwell let them go, and concentrated his attention on the person who had been the object of this startling recognition. Unquestionably a gentleman, with light hair and complexion, with a bright, benevolent face, and keen, intelligent blue eyes, apparently still in the prime of life. Such was Father Benwell's first impression of the stranger. He had evidently seen Miss Eyrecourt at the moment when she first noticed him, and he too showed signs of serious agitation. His face flushed deeply, and his eyes expressed not merely surprise, but distress. He turned to his friend. "This place is hot," he said. "Let us get out of it." "My dear Winterfield," the friend remonstrated, "we haven't seen half the pictures yet." "Excuse me if I leave you," the other replied. "I am used to the free air of the country. Let us meet again this evening. Come and dine with me. The same address as usual. Derwent's Hotel." With those words he hurried out, making his way without ceremony through the crowd in the picture gallery. Father Benwell returned to the library. It was quite needless to trouble himself further about Mrs. Eyrecourt or her address. "Thanks to Lord Loring's picture gallery," he thought, "I have found the man." He took up his pen and made a little memorandum: Winterfield, Derwent's Hotel. End of chapter 9. Read by Lars Rolander. The Story, Book the First, Chapter 10 of The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the First, Chapter 10. Father Benwell's Correspondence. 1. To Mr. Bitrake, Private and Confidential. Sir, I understand that your connection with the law does not exclude your occasional superintendence of confidential inquiries, which are not of a nature to injure your professional position. The enclosed letter of introduction will satisfy you that I am incapable of employing your experience in a manner unbecoming to you or to myself. The inquiry that I propose to you relates to a gentleman named Winterfield. He is now staying in London at Derwent's Hotel, and is expected to remain there for a week from the present day. His place of residence is on the North Devonshire coast, and is well known in that locality by the name of Beaupark House. The range of my proposed inquiry dates back over the last 4 or 5 years, certainly not more. My object is to ascertain, as positively as may be, whether, within this limit of time, events in Mr. Winterfield's life have connected him with a young lady named Miss Stella Eyrecourt. If this proves to be the case, it is essential that I should be made acquainted with the whole of the circumstances. I have now informed you of all that I want to know. Whatever the information may be, it is most important that it shall be information which I can implicitly trust. Please address to me, when you write under cover to the friend whose letter I enclose. I beg your acceptance, as time is of importance, of a check for preliminary expenses. And remain, sir, your faithful servant, Ambrose Benwell. 2. To the Secretary, Society of Jesus, Rome. I enclose a receipt for the remittance which your last letter confides to my care. Some of the money has been already used in prosecuting inquiries, the result of which will, as I hope and believe, enable me to effectually protect Romayne from the advances of the woman who is bent on marrying him. You tell me that our reverend fathers, lately sitting in council on the Vange Abbey affair, are anxious to hear if any positive steps have yet been taken toward the conversion of Romayne. I am happily able to gratify their wishes, as you shall now see. Yesterday I called at Romayne's hotel, to pay one of those occasional visits which help to keep up our acquaintance. He was out, and Penrose, for whom I asked next, was with him. Most fortunately, as the event proved, I had not seen Penrose, or heard from him, for some little time, and I thought it desirable to judge for myself of the progress that he was making in the confidence of his employer. I said I should wait. The hotel servant knows me by sight. I was shown into Romayne's waiting room. This room is so small as to be a mere cupboard. It is lighted by a glass fanlight over the door, which opens from the passage and is supplied with air, in the absence of a fireplace, by a ventilator in a second door, which communicates with Romayne's study. Looking about me so far, I crossed to the other end of the study, and discovered a dining room and 2 bedrooms beyond, the set of apartments being secluded, by means of a door at the end of the passage, from the other parts of the hotel. I trouble you with these details in order that you may understand the events that followed. I returned to the waiting room, not forgetting, of course, to close the door of communication. Nearly an hour must have passed before I heard footsteps in the passage. The study door was opened, and the voices of persons entering the room reached me through the ventilator. I recognized Romayne, Penrose, and Lord Loring. The first words exchanged among them informed me that Romayne and his secretary had overtaken Lord Loring in the street, as he was approaching the hotel door. The three had entered the house together, at a time, probably, when the servant who admitted me was out of the way. However it may have happened, there I was forgotten in the waiting room. Could I intrude myself, on a private conversation perhaps, as an unannounced and unwelcome visitor? And could I help it, if the talk found its way to me through the ventilator, along with the air that I breathed? If our reverend fathers think I was to blame, I bow to any reproof which their strict sense of propriety may inflict on me. In the meantime, I beg to repeat the interesting passages in the conversation, as nearly word for word as I can remember them. His lordship, as the principal personage in social rank, shall be reported first. He said: "More than a week has passed, Romayne, and we have neither seen you nor heard from you. Why have you neglected us?" Here, judging by certain sounds that followed, Penrose got up discreetly and left the room. Lord Loring went on. He said to Romayne: "Now we are alone, I may speak to you more freely. You and Stella seemed to get on together admirably that evening when you dined with us. Have you forgotten what you told me of her influence over you? Or have you altered your opinion, and is that the reason why you keep away from us?" Romayne answered: "My opinion remains unchanged. All that I said to you of Miss Eyrecourt, I believe as firmly as ever." His lordship remonstrated naturally enough. "Then why remain away from the good influence? Why, if it really can be controlled, risk another return of that dreadful nervous delusion?" "I have had another return." "Which, as you yourself believe, might have been prevented? Romayne, you astonish me." There was a time of silence before Romayne answered this. He was a little mysterious when he did reply. "You know the old saying, my good friend, 'Of two evils choose the least.' I bear my sufferings as one of two evils, and the least of the two." Lord Loring appeared to feel the necessity of touching a delicate subject with a light hand. He said, in his pleasant way: "Stella isn't the other evil, I suppose?" "Most assuredly not." "Then what is it?" Romayne answered almost passionately: "My own weakness and selfishness faults which I must resist, or become a mean and heartless man. For me, the worst of the two evils is there. I respect and admire Miss Eyrecourt. I believe her to be a woman in 1,000. Don't ask me to see her again. Where is Penrose? Let us talk of something else." Whether this wild way of speaking offended Lord Loring, or only discouraged him, I cannot say. I heard him take his leave in these words: "You have disappointed me, Romayne. We will talk of something else the next time we meet." The study door was opened and closed. Romayne was left by himself. Solitude was apparently not to his taste just then. I heard him call to Penrose. I heard Penrose ask, "Do you want me?" Romayne answered, "God knows I want a friend, and I have no friend near me but you. Major Hynd is away, and Lord Loring is offended with me." Penrose asked why. Romayne thereupon entered on the necessary explanation. As a priest writing to priests, I pass over details utterly uninteresting to us. The substance of what he said amounted to this: Miss Eyrecourt had produced an impression on him which was new to him in his experience of women. If he saw more of her, it might end, I ask your pardon for repeating the ridiculous expression, in his falling in love with her. In this condition of mind or body, whichever it may be, he would probably be incapable of the self control which he had hitherto practiced. If she consented to devote her life to him, he might accept the cruel sacrifice. Rather than do this, he would keep away from her, for her dear sake, no matter what he might suffer, or whom he might offend. Imagine any human being out of a lunatic asylum talking in this way. Shall I own to you, my reverend colleague, how this curious self exposure struck me? As I listened to Romayne, I felt grateful to the famous council which definitely forbade the priests of the Catholic Church to marry. We might otherwise have been morally enervated by the weakness which degrades Romayne, and priests might have become instruments in the hands of women. But you will be anxious to hear what Penrose did under the circumstances. For the moment, I can tell you this: he startled me. Instead of seizing the opportunity and directing Romayne's mind to the consolations of religion, Penrose actually encouraged him to reconsider his decision. All the weakness of my poor little Arthur's character showed itself in his next words. He said to Romayne: "It may be wrong in me to speak to you as freely as I wish to speak. But you have so generously admitted me to your confidence, you have been so considerate and so kind toward me, that I feel an interest in your happiness, which perhaps makes me overbold. Are you very sure that some such entire change in your life as your marriage might not end in delivering you from your burden? If such a thing could be, is it wrong to suppose that your wife's good influence over you might be the means of making your marriage a happy one? I must not presume to offer an opinion on such a subject. It is only my gratitude, my true attachment to you, that ventures to put the question. Are you conscious of having given this matter, so serious a matter for you, sufficient thought?" "Make your minds easy, reverend sir. Romayne's answer set everything right. He said, 'I have thought of it till I could think no longer. I still believe that sweet woman might control the torment of the voice. But could she deliver me from the remorse perpetually gnawing at my heart? I feel as murderers feel, in taking another man's life, a man who had not even injured me. I have committed the one unatonable and unpardonable sin. Can any human creature's influence make me forget that? No more of it, no more. Come, let us take refuge in our books." Those words touched Penrose in the right place. Now, as I understand his scruples, he felt that he might honorably speak out. His zeal more than balanced his weakness, as you will presently see. He was loud, he was positive, when I heard him next. "No," he burst out, "your refuge is not in books, and not in the barren religious forms which call themselves Protestant. Dear master, the peace of mind which you believe you have lost forever, you will find again in the divine wisdom and compassion of the Holy Catholic Church. There is the remedy for all that you suffer. There is the new life that will yet make you a happy man." I repeat what he said so far, merely to satisfy you that we can trust his enthusiasm, when it is once roused. Nothing will discourage, nothing will defeat him now. He spoke with all the eloquence of conviction, using the necessary arguments with a force and feeling which I have rarely heard equaled. Romayne's silence vouched for the effect on him. He is not the man to listen patiently to reasoning which he thinks he can overthrow. Having heard enough to satisfy me that Penrose had really begun the good work, I quietly slipped out of the waiting room and left the hotel. Today being Sunday, I shall not lose a post if I keep my letter open until tomorrow. I have already sent a note to Penrose, asking him to call on me at his earliest convenience. There may be more news for you before post time. Monday, 10 a.m. There is more news. Penrose has just left me. His first proceeding, of course, was to tell me what I had already discovered for myself. He is modest, as usual, about the prospect of success which awaits him. But he has induced Romayne to suspend his historical studies for a few days, and to devote his attention to the books which we are accustomed to recommend for perusal in such cases as his. This is unquestionably a great gain at starting. But my news is not at an end yet. Romayne is actually playing our game. He has resolved definitely to withdraw himself from the influence of Miss Eyrecourt. In another hour he and Penrose will have left London. Their destination is kept a profound secret. All letters addressed to Romayne are to be sent to his bankers. The motive for this sudden resolution is directly traceable to Lady Loring. Her ladyship called at the hotel yesterday evening, and had a private interview with Romayne. Her object, no doubt, was to shake his resolution, and to make him submit himself again to Miss Eyrecourt's fascinations. What means of persuasion she used to effect this purpose is of course unknown to us. Penrose saw Romayne after her ladyship's departure, and describes him as violently agitated. I can quite understand it. His resolution to take refuge in secret flight, it is really nothing less, speaks for itself as to the impression produced on him, and the danger from which, for the time at least, we have escaped. Yes, I say, for the time at least. Don't let our reverend father suppose that the money expended on my private inquiries has been money thrown away. Where these miserable love affairs are concerned, women are daunted by no adverse circumstances and warned by no defeat. Romayne has left London, in dread of his own weakness. We must not forget that. The day may yet come when nothing will interpose between us and failure but my knowledge of events in Miss Eyrecourt's life. For the present, there is no more to be said. End of chapter 10. Read by Lars Rolander. The Story, Book the First, Chapter 11 of the Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the First, Chapter 11. Stella asserts herself. 2 days after Father Benwell had posted his letter to Rome, Lady Loring entered her husband's study and asked eagerly if he had heard any news of Romayne. Lord Loring shook his head. "As I told you yesterday," he said, "the proprietor of the hotel can give me no information. I went myself this morning to the banker's and saw the head partner. He offered to forward letters, but he could do no more. Until further notice, he was positively enjoined not to disclose Romayne's address to anybody. How does Stella bear it?" "In the worst possible way," Lady Loring answered. "In silence." "Not a word, even to you?" "Not a word." At that reply, the servant interrupted them by announcing the arrival of a visitor, and presenting his card. Lord Loring started, and handed it to his wife. The card bore the name of Major Hynd, and this line was added in pencil: "On business connected with Mr. Romayne." "Show him in directly!" cried Lady Loring. Lord Loring remonstrated. "My dear, perhaps I had better see this gentleman alone?" "Certainly not, unless you wish to drive me into committing an act of the most revolting meanness. If you send me away, I shall listen at the door." Major Hynd was shown in, and was duly presented to Lady Loring. After making the customary apologies, he said: "I returned to London last night expressly to see Romayne on a matter of importance. Failing to discover his present address at the hotel, I had the hope that your lordship might be able to direct me to our friend." "I am sorry to say I know no more than you do," Lord Loring replied. "Romayne's present address is a secret confided to his bankers, and to no one else. I will give you their names, if you wish to write to him." Major Hynd hesitated. "I am not quite sure that it would be discreet to write to him under the circumstances." Lady Loring could no longer keep silence. "Is it possible, Major Hynd, to tell us what the circumstances are?" she asked. "I am almost as old a friend of Romayne's as my husband, and I am very anxious about him." The Major looked embarrassed. "I can hardly answer your ladyship," he said, "without reviving painful recollections." Lady Loring's impatience interrupted the Major's apologies. "Do you mean the duel?" she inquired. Lord Loring interposed. "I should tell you, Major Hynd, that Lady Loring is as well informed as I am of what happened at Boulogne, and of the deplorable result, so far as Romayne is concerned. If you still wish to speak to me privately, I will ask you to accompany me into the next room." Major Hynd's embarrassment vanished. "After what you tell me," he said, "I hope to be favored with Lady Loring's advice. You both know that Romayne fought the fatal duel with the son of the French general who had challenged him. When we returned to England, we heard that the general and his family had been driven away from Boulogne by pecuniary difficulties. Romayne, against my advice, wrote to the surgeon who had been present at the duel, desiring that the general's place of retreat might be discovered, and expressing his wish to assist the family anonymously, as their unknown friend. The motive, of course, was, in his own words, to make some little atonement to the poor people whom he had wronged. I thought it a rash proceeding at the time, and I am confirmed in my opinion by a letter from the surgeon, received yesterday. Will you kindly read it to Lady Loring?" He handed the letter to Lord Loring. Translated from French, it ran as follows: "Sir, I am at last able to answer Mr. Romayne's letter definitely, with the courteous assistance of the French consul in London, to whom I applied when other means of investigation had produced no result. A week since the General died, circumstances connected with the burial expenses informed the consul that he had taken refuge from his creditors, not in Paris, as we supposed, but in London. The address is number 10, Camp's Hill, Islington. I should also add that the General, for obvious reasons, lived in London under the assumed name of Marillac. It will be necessary, therefore, to inquire for his widow by the name of Madame Marillac. You will perhaps be surprised to find that I address these lines to you instead of to Mr. Romayne. The reason is soon told. I was acquainted with the late General, as you know, at the time when I was not aware of the company that he kept, or of the deplorable errors into which his love of gambling had betrayed him. Of his widow and his children I know absolutely nothing. Whether they have resisted the contaminating influence of the head of the household, or whether poverty and bad example combined have hopelessly degraded them, I cannot say. There is at least a doubt whether they are worthy of Mr. Romayne's benevolent intentions toward them. As an honest man, I cannot feel this doubt, and reconcile it to my conscience to be the means, however indirectly, of introducing them to Mr. Romayne. To your discretion I leave it to act for the best, after this warning. Lord Loring returned the letter to Major Hynd. "I agree with you," he said. "It is more than doubtful whether you ought to communicate this information to Romayne." Lady Loring was not quite of her husband's opinion. "While there is a doubt about these people," she said, "it seems only just to find out what sort of character they bear in the neighborhood. In your place, Major Hynd, I should apply to the person in whose house they live, or to the tradespeople whom they have employed." "I am obliged to leave London again to day," the Major replied. "But on my return I will certainly follow your ladyship's advice." "And you will let us know the result?" "With the greatest pleasure." Major Hynd took his leave. "I think you will be responsible for wasting the Major's time," said Lord Loring, when the visitor had retired. "I think not," said Lady Loring. She rose to leave the room. "Are you going out?" her husband asked. "No, I am going upstairs to Stella." Lady Loring found Miss Eyrecourt in her own room. The little portrait of Romayne, which she had drawn from recollection, lay on the table before her. She was examining it with the closest attention. "Well, Stella, and what does the portrait tell you?" "What I knew before, Adelaide. There is nothing false and nothing cruel in that face." "And does the discovery satisfy you? For my part, I despise Romayne for hiding himself from us. Can you excuse him?" Stella locked up the portrait in her writing case. "I can wait," she said quietly. This assertion of patience seemed to irritate Lady Loring. "What is the matter with you this morning?" she asked. "You are more reserved than ever." "No, I am only out of spirits, Adelaide. I can't help thinking of that meeting with Winterfield. I feel as if some misfortune was hanging over my head." "Don't speak of that hateful man!" her ladyship exclaimed. "I have something to tell you about Romayne. Are you completely absorbed in your presentiments of evil? Or do you think you can listen to me?" Stella's face answered for her. Lady Loring described the interview with Major Hynd in the minutest detail, including, by way of illustration, the Major's manners and personal appearance. "He and Lord Loring," she added, "both think that Romayne will never hear the last of it if he allows these foreigners to look to him for money. Until something more is known about them, the letter is not to be forwarded." "I wish I had the letter!" cried Stella. "Would you forward it to Romayne?" "Instantly! Does it matter whether these poor French people are worthy of his generosity, if it restores his tranquillity to help them? Who cares whether they deserve the help? They are not even to know who it is that assists them. Romayne is to be their unknown friend. It is he, not they, whom we have to think of. His peace of mind is everything. Their merit is nothing. I say it's cruel to him to keep him in ignorance of what has happened. Why didn't you take the letter away from Major Hynd?" "Gently, Stella! The Major is going to make inquiries about the widow and children when he returns to London." "When he returns!" Stella repeated indignantly. "Who knows what the poor wretches may be suffering in the interval?
and what Romayne may feel if he ever hears of it. Tell me the address again. It was somewhere in Islington, you said."
"Why do you want to know it?" Lady Loring asked. "You are not going to write to Romayne yourself?"
"I am going to think before I do anything. If you can't trust my discretion, Adelaide, you have only to say so."
It was spoken sharply. Lady Loring's reply betrayed a certain loss of temper on her side. "Manage your own affairs, Stella. I have done meddling with them." Her unlucky visit to Romayne at the hotel had been a subject of dispute between the two friends, and this referred to it. "You shall have the address," my lady added in her grandest manner. She wrote it on a piece of paper, and left the room. Easily irritated, Lady Loring had the merit of being easily appeased. That meanest of all vices, the vice of sulkiness, had no existence in her nature. In 5 minutes she regretted her little outburst of irritability. For 5 minutes more she waited, on the chance that Stella might be the first to seek a reconciliation. The interval passed, and nothing happened. "Have I really offended her?" Lady Loring asked herself. The next moment she was on her way back to Stella. The room was empty. She rang the bell for the maid. "Where is Miss Eyrecourt?" "Gone out, my lady."
"Did she leave no message?"
"No, my lady. She went away in a great hurry."
Lady Loring at once drew the conclusion that Stella had rashly taken the affair of the General's family into her own hands. Was it possible to say how this most imprudent proceeding might end? After hesitating and reflecting, and hesitating again, Lady Loring's anxiety got beyond her control. She not only decided on following Stella, but, in the excess of her nervous apprehension, she took one of the men servants with her in case of emergency. End of chapter 11. Read by Lars Rolander. The Story, Book the First, Chapter 12 of The Black Robe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Black Robe by Wilkie Collins. The Story, Book the First, Chapter 12. The General's Family. Not always remarkable for arriving at just conclusions, Lady Loring had drawn the right inference this time. Stella had stopped the first cab that passed her, and had directed the driver to Camp's Hill, Islington. The aspect of the miserable little street, closed at one end, and swarming with dirty children, quarreling over their play, daunted her for the moment. Even the cabman, drawing up at the entrance to the street, expressed his opinion that it was a queer sort of place for a young lady to venture into alone. Stella thought of Romayne. Her firm persuasion that she was helping him to perform an act of mercy, which was to his mind an act of atonement as well, roused her courage. She boldly approached the open door of number 10, and knocked on it with her parasol. The tangled gray hair and grimy face of a hideous old woman showed themselves slowly at the end of the passage, rising from the strong smelling obscurity of the kitchen regions. "What do you want?" said the half seen witch of the London slums. "Does Madame Marillac live here?" Stella asked. "Do you mean the foreigner?" "Yes." "Second door." With those instructions, the upper half of the witch sank and vanished. Stella gathered her skirts together, and ascended a filthy flight of stairs for the first time in her life. Coarse voices, shameless language, gross laughter behind the closed doors of the first floor hurried her on her way to the rooms on the higher flight. Here there was a change for the better. Here, at least, there was silence. She knocked at the door on the landing of the second floor. A gentle voice answered in French, "Entrez," then quickly substituted the English equivalent, "Come in." Stella opened the door. The wretchedly furnished room was scrupulously clean. Above the truckle bed, a cheap little image of the Virgin was fastened to the wall, with some faded artificial flowers arranged above it in the form of a wreath. Two women, in dresses of coarse black stuff, sat at a small round table, working at the same piece of embroidery. The elder of the two rose when the visitor entered the room. Her worn and weary face still showed the remains of beauty in its finely proportioned parts. Her dim eyes rested on Stella with an expression of piteous entreaty. "Have you come for the work, madam?" she asked in English, spoken with a strong foreign accent. "Pray forgive me; I have not finished it yet." The second of the two workwomen suddenly looked up. She too was wan and frail, but her eyes were bright, her movements still preserved the elasticity of youth. Her likeness to the elder woman proclaimed their relationship, even before she spoke. "Ah, it's my fault!" she burst out passionately in French. "I was hungry and tired, and I slept hours longer than I ought. My mother was too kind to wake me and set me to work. I am a selfish wretch, and my mother is an angel." She dashed away the tears gathering in her eyes, and proudly, fiercely resumed her work. Stella hastened to reassure them the moment she could make herself heard. "Indeed, I have nothing to do with the work," she said, speaking in French, so that they might the more readily understand her. "I came here, Madame Marillac, if you will not be offended with me for plainly owing it, to offer you some little help." "Charity?" asked the daughter, looking up again sternly from her needle. "Sympathy," Stella answered gently. The girl resumed her work. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I shall learn to submit to my lot in time." The quiet, long suffering mother placed a chair for Stella. "You have a kind, beautiful face, miss," she said, "and I am sure you will make allowances for my poor girl. I remember the time when I was as quick to feel as she is. May I ask how you came to hear of us?" "I hope you will excuse me," Stella replied. "I am not at liberty to answer that question." The mother said nothing. The daughter asked sharply, "Why not?" Stella addressed her answer to the mother. "I come from a person who desires to be of service to you as an unknown friend," she said. The wan face of the widow suddenly brightened. "Oh!" she exclaimed. "Has my brother heard of the General's death? And has he forgiven me my marriage at last?" "No, no," Stella interposed. "I must not mislead you. The person whom I represent is no relation of yours." Even in spite of this positive assertion, the poor woman held desperately to the hope that had been roused in her. "The name by which you know me may mislead you," she suggested anxiously. "My late husband assumed the name in his exile here. Perhaps if I told you—" The daughter stopped her there. "My dear mother, leave this to me." The widow sighed resignedly, and resumed her work. "Madame Marillac will do very well as a name," the girl continued, turning to Stella, "until we know something more of each other. I suppose you are well acquainted with the person whom you represent?" "Certainly, or I should not be here." "You know the person's family connections in that case? And you can say for certain whether they are French connections or not?" "I can say for certain," Stella answered, "that they are English connections. I represent a friend who feels kindly toward Madame Marillac, nothing more." "You see, mother, you were mistaken. Bear it as bravely, dear, as you have borne other trials." Saying this very tenderly, she addressed herself once more to Stella, without attempting to conceal the accompanying change in her manner to coldness and distrust. "One of us must speak plainly," she said. "Our few friends are nearly as poor as we are, and they are all French. I tell you positively that we have no English friends. How has this anonymous benefactor been informed of our poverty? You are a stranger to us. You cannot have given the information." Stella's eyes were now open to the awkward position in which she had placed herself. She met the difficulty boldly, still upheld by the conviction that she was serving a purpose cherished by Romayne. "You had good reasons, no doubt, mademoiselle, when you advised your mother to conceal her true name," she rejoined. "Be just enough to believe that your anonymous benefactor has good reasons for concealment too." It was well said, and it encouraged Madame Marillac to take Stella's part. "My dear Blanche, you speak rather harshly to this good young lady," she said to her daughter. "You have only to look at her, and to see that she means well." Blanche took up her needle again with dogged submission. "If we are to accept charity, mother, I should like to know the hand that gives it," she answered. "I will say no more." "When you are as old as I am, my dear," rejoined Madame Marillac, "you will not think quite so positively as you think now. I have learned some hard lessons," she proceeded, turning to Stella, "and I hope I am the better for them. My life has not been a happy one." "Your life has been a martyrdom," said the girl, breaking out again in spite of herself. "Oh, my father! My father!" She pushed aside the work, and hid her face in her hands. The gentle mother spoke severely for the first time. "Respect your father's memory," she said. Blanche trembled, and kept silence. "I have no false pride," Madame Marillac continued. "I own that we are miserably poor; and I thank you, my dear young lady, for your kind intentions toward us, without embarrassing you by any inquiries. We manage to live. While my eyes last, our work helps to support us. My good eldest daughter has some employment as a teacher of music, and contributes her little share to assist our poor household. I don't distrust you. I only say, let us try a little longer, if we cannot help ourselves." She had barely pronounced the last words, when a startling interruption led to consequences which the persons present had not foreseen. A shrill, wailing voice suddenly pierced through the flimsy partition which divided the front room and the back room. "Bread!" cried the voice in French. "I'm hungry! Bread! Bread!" The daughter started to her feet. "Think of his betraying us at this moment!" she exclaimed indignantly. The mother rose in silence, and opened a cupboard. Its position was opposite to the place in which Stella was sitting. She saw 2 or 3 knives and forks, some cups and saucers and plates, and a folded tablecloth. Nothing else appeared on the shelves, not even the stray crust of bread for which the poor woman had been looking. "Go, my dear, and quiet your brother," she said, and closed the cupboard door again as patiently as ever. Stella opened her pocketbook when Blanche had left the room. "For God's sake, take something!" she cried. "I offer it with sincerest respect. I offer it as a loan." Madame Marillac gently signed to Stella to close the pocketbook again. "That kind heart of yours must not be distressed about trifles," she said. "The baker will trust us until we get the money for our work, and my daughter knows it. If you can tell me nothing else, my dear, will you tell me your Christian name? It is painful to me to speak to you quite as a stranger." Stella at once complied with the request. Madame Marillac smiled as she repeated the name. "There is almost another tie between us," she said. "We have your name in France. It speaks with a familiar sound to me in this strange place. Dear Miss Stella, when my poor boy startled you by that cry for food, he recalled to me the saddest of all my anxieties. When I think of him, I should be tempted, if my better sense did not restrain me. No, no, put back the pocketbook. I am incapable of the shameless audacity of borrowing a sum of money which I could never repay. Let me tell you what my trouble is, and you will understand that I am in earnest. I had 2 sons, Miss Stella. The elder, the most lovable, the most affectionate of my children, was killed in a duel." The sudden disclosure drew a cry of sympathy from Stella, which she was not mistress enough of herself to repress. Now, for the first time, she understood the remorse that tortured Romayne, as she had not understood it when Lady Loring had told the terrible story of the duel. Attributing the effect produced on her to the sensitive nature of a young woman, Madame Marillac innocently added to Stella's distress by making excuses. "I am sorry to have frightened you, my dear," she said. "In your happy country such a dreadful death as my son's is unknown. I am obliged to mention it, or you might not understand what I have still to say. Perhaps I had better not go on." Stella roused herself. "Yes, yes," she answered eagerly. "Pray go on." "My son in the next room," the widow resumed, "is only 14 years old. It has pleased God sorely to afflict a harmless creature. He has not been in his right mind since the miserable day when he followed the duelists and saw his brother's death. Oh, you are turning pale! How thoughtless, how cruel of me! I ought to have remembered that such horrors as these have never overshadowed your happy life." Struggling to recover her self control, Stella tried to reassure Madame Marillac by a gesture. The voice which she had heard in the next room was, as she now knew, the voice that haunted Romayne. Not the words that had pleaded hunger and called for bread, but those other words, "Assassin! Assassin! Where are you?" rang in her ears. She entreated Madame Marillac to break the unendurable interval of silence. The widow's calm voice had a soothing influence, which she was eager to feel. "Go on," she repeated. "Pray go on." "I ought not to lay all the blame of my boy's affliction on the duel," said Madame Marillac. "In childhood, his mind never grew with his bodily growth. His brother's death may have only hurried the result which was sooner or later but too sure to come. You need feel no fear of him. He is never violent, and he is the most beautiful of my children. Would you like to see him?" "No, I would rather hear you speak of him. Is he not conscious of his own misfortune?" "For weeks together, Stella. I am sure I may call you Stella? He is quite calm. You would see no difference outwardly between him and other boys. Unhappily, it is just at those times that the spirit of impatience seems to possess him. He watches his opportunity, and however carefully we may be, he is cunning enough to escape our vigilance." "Do you mean that he leaves you and his sisters?" "Yes, that is what I mean. For nearly 2 months past he has been away from us. Yesterday only his return relieved us from a state of suspense which I cannot attempt to describe. We don't know where he has been, nor in the company of what persons he has passed the time of his absence. No persuasion will induce him to speak to us on the subject. This morning we listened while he was talking to himself." "Was it part of the boy's madness to repeat the words which still tormented Romayne?" Stella asked if he ever spoke of the duel. "Never. He seems to have lost all memory of it. We only heard this morning one or two unconnected words, something about a woman, and then more that appeared to allude to some person's death. Last night I was with him when he went to bed, and I found that he had something to conceal from me. He let me fold all his clothes as usual, except his waistcoat, and that he snatched away from me and put it under his pillow. We have no hope of being able to examine the waistcoat without his knowledge. His sleep is like the sleep of a dog. If you only approach him, he wakes instantly. Forgive me for troubling you with these trifling details, only interesting to ourselves. You will at least understand the constant anxiety that we suffer." "In your unhappy position," said Stella, "I should try to resign myself to parting with him. I mean, to placing him under medical care." The mother's face saddened. "I have inquired about it," she answered. "He must pass a night in the workhouse before he can be received as a pauper lunatic in a public asylum. Oh, my dear, I am afraid there is some pride still left in me. He is my only son now. His father was a general in the French army. I was brought up among people of good blood and breeding. I can't take my own boy to the workhouse."
Stella understood her. "I feel for you with all my heart," she said. "Place him privately, dear Madame Marillac, under skillful and kind control. And do let me open the pocketbook again." The widow steadily refused even to look at the pocketbook. "Perhaps," Stella persisted, "you don't know of a private asylum that would satisfy you?" "My dear, I do know of such a place. The good doctor who attended my husband in his last illness told me of it. A friend of his receives a certain number of poor people into his house, and charges no more than the cost of maintaining them, an unattainable sum to me. There is the temptation that I spoke of. The help of a few pounds I might accept if I fell ill, because I might afterward pay it back. But a larger sum, never!" She rose, as if to end the interview. Stella tried every means of persuasion that she could think of, and tried in vain. The friendly dispute between them might have been prolonged, if they had not both been silenced by another interruption from the next room. This time it was not only endurable, it was even welcome. The poor boy was playing the air of a French vaudeville on a pipe or flageolet. "Now he is happy," said the mother. "He is a born musician. Do come and see him." An idea struck Stella. She overcame the inveterate reluctance in her to see the boy so fatally associated with the misery of Romayne's life. As Madame Marillac led the way to the door of communication between the rooms, she quickly took from her pocketbook the banknotes with which she had provided herself, and folded them so that they could be easily concealed in her hand. She followed the widow into the little room. The boy was sitting on his bed. He laid down his flageolet and bowed to Stella. His long silky hair flowed to his shoulders. But one betrayal of a deranged mind presented itself in his delicate face. His large soft eyes had the glassy, vacant look which it is impossible to mistake. "Do you like music, mademoiselle?" he asked gently. Stella asked him to play his little vaudeville air again. He proudly complied with the request. His sister seemed to resent the presence of a stranger. "The work is at a standstill," she said, and passed into the front room. Her mother followed her as far as the door to give her some necessary directions. Stella seized her opportunity. She put the banknotes into the pocket of the boy's jacket, and whispered to him: "Give them to your mother when I have gone away." Under those circumstances, she felt sure that Madame Marillac would yield to the temptation. She could resist much, but she could not resist her son. The boy nodded, to show that he understood her. The moment after, he laid down his flageolet with an expression of surprise. "You are trembling," he said. "Are you frightened?" She was frightened. The mere sense of touching him had made her shudder. Did she feel a vague presentiment of some evil to come from that momentary association with him? Madame Marillac, turning away again from her daughter, noticed Stella's agitation. "Surely my poor boy doesn't alarm you?" she said. Before Stella could answer, some one outside knocked at the door. Lady Loring's servant appeared, charged with a carefully worded message. "If you please, miss, a friend is waiting for you below." Any excuse for departure was welcome to Stella at that moment. She promised to call at the house again in a few days. Madame Marillac kissed her on the forehead as she took leave. Her nerves were still shaken by that momentary contact with the boy. Descending the stairs, she trembled so that she was obliged to hold by the servant's arm. She was not naturally timid. What did it mean? Lady Loring's carriage was waiting at the entrance of the street, with all the children in the neighborhood assembled to admire it. She impulsively forestalled the servant in opening the carriage door. "Come in!" she cried. "Oh, Stella, you don't know how you have frightened me! Good heavens, you look frightened yourself! From what wretches have I rescued you? Take my smelling bottle, and tell me all about it." The fresh air and the reassuring presence of her old friend revived Stella. She was able to describe her interview with the General's family, and to answer the inevitable inquiries which the narrative called forth. Lady Loring's last question was the most important of the series. "What are you going to do about Romayne?" "I am going to write to him the moment we get home." The answer seemed to alarm Lady Loring. "You won't betray me?" she said. "What do you mean?" "You won't let Romayne discover that I have told you about the duel?" "Certainly not. You shall see my letter before I send it to be forwarded." Tranquilized so far, Lady Loring bethought herself next of Major Hynd. "Can we tell him what you have done?" her ladyship asked. "Of course we can tell him," Stella replied. "I shall conceal nothing from Lord Loring, and I shall beg your good husband to write to the Major. He need only say that I have made the necessary inquiries, after being informed of the circumstances by you, and that I have communicated the favorable result to Mr. Romayne." "It's easy enough to write the letter, my dear. But it's not so easy to say what Major Hynd may think of you." "Does it matter to me what Major Hynd thinks?" Lady Loring looked at Stella with a malicious smile. "Are you equally indifferent," she said, "to what Romayne's opinion of your conduct may be?" Stella's color rose. "Try to be serious, Adelaide, when you speak to me of Romayne," she answered gravely. "His good opinion of me is the breath of my life." An hour later, the important letter to Romayne was written. Stella scrupulously informed him of all that had happened, with two necessary omissions. In the first place, nothing was said of the widow's reference to her son's death, and of the effect produced by it on his younger brother. The boy was simply described as being of weak intellect, and as requiring to be kept under competent control. In the second place, Romayne was left to infer that ordinary motives of benevolence were the only motives, on his part, known to Miss Eyrecourt. The letter ended in these lines: "If I have taken an undue liberty in venturing, unasked, to appear as your representative, I can only plead that I meant well. It seemed to me to be hard on these poor people, and not just to you, in your absence, to interpose any needless delays in carrying out those kind intentions of yours, which had no doubt been properly considered beforehand. In forming your opinion of my conduct, pray remember that I have been careful not to compromise you in any way. You are only known to Madame Marillac as a compassionate person who offers to help her, and who wishes to give that help anonymously. If, notwithstanding this, you disapprove of what I have done, I must not conceal that it will grieve and humiliate me. I have been so eager to be of use to you, when others appeared to hesitate. I must find my consolation in remembering that I have become acquainted with one of the sweetest and noblest of women, and that I have helped to preserve her afflicted son from dangers in the future which I cannot presume to estimate. You will complete what I have only begun. Be forbearing and kind to me if I have innocently offended in this matter, and I shall gratefully remember the day when I took it on myself to be Mr. Romayne's almoner." Lady Loring read these concluding sentences twice over. "I think the end of your letter will have its effect on him," she said. "If it brings me a kind letter in reply," Stella answered, "it will have all the effect I hope for." "If it does anything," Lady Loring rejoined, "it will do more than that." "What more can it do?" "My dear, it can bring Romayne back to you." Those hopeful words seemed rather to startle Stella than to encourage her. "Bring him back to me?" she repeated. "Oh, Adelaide, I wish I could think as you do!" "Send the letter to the post," said Lady Loring, "and we shall see." End of chapter 12. Read by Lars Rolander.